Hi everybody, welcome back. Glad you could tune in again. So we've reached Colossians chapter 2, verse 8, and I want to read down a slightly larger passage today than I did yesterday, down to verse 15, and then make a few comments about it. Just a heads up before we begin, this is where Paul, as I suggested before, so to speak, turns a corner slightly in his exposition. And what he's now looking at is these dark storm clouds that are on the horizon of the ancient church in Colossae, which they need to watch out for if they're to remain faithful to Christ. So verse 8, let's take a look at what these dark storm clouds are and what exactly Paul has to say about them. Verse 8, see to it that no one takes you captive by philosophy and empty deceit, according to human tradition, according to the elemental spirits of the world, and not according to Christ. You see there, just briefly in passing, it's not that they've already been taken captive, but they need to watch that they're not in future. See to it that no one takes you captive. Verse 9, for in him, that is in Christ, the whole fullness of deity dwells bodily, and you have been filled in him who is the head of all rule and authority. In him also you were circumcised with a circumcision made without hands, by putting off the body of the flesh by the circumcision of Christ, having been buried with him in baptism, in which you were also raised with him through faith in the powerful working of God who raised him from the dead. And you, who were dead in your trespasses and the uncircumcision of your flesh, God made alive together with him, having forgiven all our trespasses by cancelling the record of debt that stood against us with its legal demands. This he set aside, nailing it to the cross. He disarmed the rulers and authorities and put them to open shame by triumphing over them in him. Okay, so what's going on here? Well, the big question that tends to exercise the minds of scholars and commentators and so on in reflecting on this text and the passage that immediately follows is, what exactly is it that Paul is warning the Colossian church about? He speaks of it somewhat allusively, and in many strands of the scholarship, the conclusion seems to be that Paul is warning them against some kind of ancient pagan or unchristian religion which would seek to divert their attention away from Christ himself. And you can see why they would imagine that. Some of the language that Paul uses, for example, in verse 8, seems to be most at home in a kind of mixture of philosophical and ancient spiritual, if that's not to misuse the word, traditions. So, for example, see to it no one takes you captive by philosophy and empty deceit. He speaks of human tradition. And then crucially, he uses this phrase, which is translated here, the elemental spirits of the world, which in some contexts, some scholars argue, is used to denote pagan practices of some sort. And so the claim is that what Paul's warning these ancient Christians against is probably Greek philosophy-influenced pagan religious practices. And that then, they suggest, resonates with other aspects of the passage. For example, verse 9, Paul says, for in him the whole fullness of deity or godness dwells bodily, as though he's wanting to satisfy their anxiety that perhaps these other religious systems offer a closer access to God. Well, no, it's in Christ that the fullness of deity dwells. Also, you look in verse 10, Paul speaks of rule and authority, and in verse 15, rulers and authorities. These, it is suggested in some quarters, are references to supernatural or ancient angelic powers, rulers and authorities, angelic powers perhaps, that those other pagan religious traditions might be somehow associated with. And Paul wants to say the obvious thing, that if those things exist at all, Christ is the head of them. He's disarmed the rulers and authorities. You don't need to seek refuge in the religious systems that they're supposed to have established and so on. Paul is emphasizing the supremacy of Christ over all those systems. And so that's what he's worried that the Colossians might succumb to, and he warns them against it. Now, that's all possible, and certainly if that was something that was threatening the Colossian church, they would do well to steer clear of it. But I want to suggest that there's another reading, which is not unique to me by any means. This has been suggested by a number of other people, which connects the threat here not with ancient paganism, but with a form of apostate, Old Covenant Israelite faith and life, which is opposed to Christ. It's as though people want, in some circles, to retain Old Covenant Judaism, the rites and rituals and structures of Old Covenant life, and continue living as though Christ has not come, without realizing that the age of the Old Covenant order has now passed with the coming of Christ. And there are some hints about that here as well. Now, for example, that phrase, the elemental spirits of the world, though perhaps it can refer in some context to ancient pagan rituals and religious systems, it seems, at least in Galatians, where the same phrase is used, to have some reference to apostate Israelite practices. It might be that what Paul's doing is something sort of doubly subtle, that he's picking up a term which elsewhere is used to describe paganism and employing that to describe now apostate Israelite faith and life and worship. That will be exactly the sort of thing that Paul does. It seems to be what he's doing in Galatians. Maybe it's what he's doing here. He's warning the Colossian Christians, look, if you go back to a form of life which may once have been good, living, so to speak, under the Torah of Moses with circumcision and the law and the temple sacrifices, or trying to adopt temple rituals and so on. It may have been good at one point, but it's not good now. Now it's become like all the pagan systems of religion you see around you. That would also fit with another crucial section of this paragraph that I read, which is from verse 11 all the way down to certainly verse 14 and maybe verse 15, where Paul suddenly out of the blue mentions circumcision. Why, you might ask, would Paul suddenly start talking about circumcision if really what he's warning the Colossian Christians against is a form of pagan religion? It doesn't seem to make any sense. Who mentions circumcision? That's an Old Testament Israelite thing. But if what they're being seduced by, or rather, if what they're in danger of being seduced by, is a reversion to old covenant religious structures and systems, then mention of circumcision here is entirely appropriate and very relevant and fits the argument perfectly. So what Paul would then be saying is, well, no, you don't need to go back to the Torah rituals of circumcision, even though those things once were good. You don't need to go back to those in order to find the fullness of the presence of God, because in him, that is in Christ, also you were circumcised with a circumcision made not with hands, by putting off the body of the flesh by the circumcision of Christ, and so on. Now, there are complexities about what that circumcision of Christ might mean, but the underlying point is straightforward. What circumcision used to give you, so to speak, as an Old Covenant Israelite, the badge of membership of the privileged community of the people of God, it no longer gives you. It's Christ who gives you that. And so Paul slots this portion of his argument right in here to emphasize that. I've got to say that all makes more sense to me. It seems to me more likely that what's the danger here is the same thing that's the danger in so many other places in the New Testament, that the people of God in Christ would be seduced to go back to a pre-Christian form of Jewish religious life and practice, which actually has come under the judgment of God by the time these documents are written. It won't do you any good. It's become as bad as the paganism of the world around you in the ancient Greek and Roman worlds, and therefore Paul even uses some of the vocabulary of ancient paganism to describe it. One way or another, the underlying message is the same. See to it that no one takes you captive by that, whatever it is, but you remain rooted in Christ. Well, I think that'll do for now. There's always more complexity that we could delve into, but for now, the Lord bless you, and see you soon.